Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today is exciting for us because it is our first clinical culture and diversity presentation as part of our 2022-23 series. And we're fortunate in that the one in September always lines up with Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month as well. And so there's a connection to that today with our speaker, as you can see, culture and circumstances, physical activity among older Latinx in the US. Next slide, Alexa, thank you. Thank you, Alexa, for putting together this slide, because as you see, we have the set dates for our series. We always hold our clinical culture and diversity series in September, November, February, and April. And Clinical Culture and Diversity series explores issues related to intercultural communication and focuses on the clinical setting. Developing cross-cultural competencies improves patient care, provides individuals with a comprehensive educational experience, and helps KMC become a more diverse and integrated campus. Students, faculty, and staff are invited and encouraged to contribute to the conversation. So we do ask that you listen and think of questions, put them in the chat as we go through the presentation, and we will ask you to share those questions also when Dr. Marquez is finished. This series was developed by the Office of International Programs and the Office of ODI with the School of Medicine, and is co-sponsored by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office. Here's some great information for you to follow if you, when you're on Zoom, just making sure your name is the same as you want it to appear, and then continuing education credit statements for the Clinical Culture and Diversity series. Alexa also put some of this information in the chat. So if you are trying to earn continuing ed credit, you'll want to make sure your name on the screen matches how you registered so you can get the credit for this. And then there's our conflict of interest disclosures. Thank you, Alexa. Here's our continuing education code. And again, this will be repeated in our chat as well. And now to the main event. Dr. X Marquez, PhD, earned a doctoral degree and a master's degree in kinesiology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Loyola University, Chicago. He is a professor of kinesiology and nutrition and director of the Exercise Psychology Laboratory at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is also a leader of the Latino core of the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. His research focuses on reducing health disparities. Dr. Marquez spends the majority of his time working with the Latino community, older adults, and individuals at risk for Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Marquez is a fellow of the Society of Behavioral Medicine, the Gerontological Society of America, and the American College of Sports Medicine, and the National Academy of Kinesiology. Welcome, Dr. Marquez. We're so honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Alexa. Thank you to everybody, to Jaime for putting forth my name as a potential speaker in your series. It really is a genuine pleasure to be here to talk to you about my group's work. That means a lot to me personally and professionally. There are times where I tend to go, I won't say tangents necessarily, but I kind of get into the talk and derail myself and then try to get back on course, or try to remember where was I when I last talked about something on the slide. So Alexa, it's helpful that you are running the slides because then I can keep a little bit more time on, I have the clock in front of me on my laptop computer. So I am with the University of Illinois, Chicago and the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. My background is in physical activity, behavior, promotion, and outcomes of physical activity. And so over the years, I've talked about physical activity in Latinos, older Latinos specifically, and about how culture and what I call circumstance really come into play with older Latinos either being physically active or not being physically active. Next slide, please. So you might have noticed that I had Latinx in the title. Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might not. Some of you might like the term and prefer the terms. Others might be vehemently against the term Latinx. So I want to say up front, this is where I'm coming from. We know that the Spanish language is gendered, right? The male term is the universal term for everyone. For example, if there's 99 women in the room, Latina women, and then one male joins them, now it is referred to as a group of Latinos with the O because there's male presence. So the X, what the X is meant to do, it's meant to be a universal term, a more inclusive term, and a gender neutral or non-binary alternative. Then people say, well, how am I supposed to pronounce that in Espanol with an X? Great point. We haven't really addressed that. So some have recommended the letter E, because then it can be said and written more easily. And it would be a more inclusive term. You will see in the rest of my presentation, I use the terms Latino and Latina because this is what the people that the older adults that we work with in the Chicago area, that they identify more so with. So I'm going to say Latino and Latina, but I wanted to put this up front because I really appreciate the inclusive terms and the gender neutral, non-binary alternatives. Okay, next slide, please. So here's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today. So some background information about Latinos in the United States and cultural values that tend to cut across different cultural heritages of Latinos, and how they could play a role in the physical activity of Latinos. First, I'll speak generally about that, and then I'll get into more specific examples from the research that my group has done, largely based on promoting Latin dance as a form of physical activity. Next slide, please. Latinos, actually for a number of years now in the US, are the largest ethnic or racial minority group. And we do vary in culture, race, and immigration status. But if you look at the bar graph here, you see this steady, almost linear increase in the number of Latinos, the proportion of the US population that is Latino. Okay, so up to a few years ago, 18.5%. When I was in graduate school, right around 2000, just after 2000, and I started doing my own presentations on Latinos, I remember US Census Bureau was at 12%. Okay, so in these 15 to 20 years, a really significant increase in the number of Latinos in the United States. So this is Latinos of all ages. Next slide, please. When we talk about Latinos and in the work that I do, I tend to think a lot about the health. What is the health like of Latinos within the United States? There is the Hispanic Community Health Study, or the SOL study, the study of Latinos, which is the largest epidemiological study of Latinos in the US to date. And I have Dr. DeViglis's name there. She is the PI of the Chicago site. What's really wonderful about, well, many things that are wonderful about the SOL study, but in particular, there are 4 field sites in San Diego, Chicago, New York, and Miami. And those were not done at random. By having sites and data collection in different cities of the US, geographic regions, they were able to get a better sampling of those of Mexican heritage, Puerto Rican heritage, Dominican, Cuban, and then as a group, South American heritages as well. And so this is important as a general note to, many times we tend to group people into categories, and so Latino or Hispanic tends to be one of them. But we know that there are important and distinct differences, histories, etc. So this study was able to break people down. Next slide, please. The next couple slides I'm going to show. This one is prevalence of cardiovascular disease risk factors for Latino men. And then the next slide will look very similar, except it will be specific to Latina women. So here you can see in the columns the breakdown by cultural heritage. There are not many studies that do this. Okay, those of us that don't do large epidemiological studies really struggle to do this because we don't have the power. We don't have the number of participants that we're able to break down like this. One of the strengths of this study. So in the rows, you will see the cardiovascular disease risk factors in the 5 prevalent ones. And when I say prevalent amongst Latinos, you see a couple things here. If you can go back to the previous slide for men. So in the rows, you see a high prevalence of these across the different cultural heritages. So I went ahead, this is from a study in JAMA, and I went ahead and in the green box is for that risk factor, the lowest prevalence, and the red is the highest prevalence. So a couple things. One, you see that even the lowest prevalence is high. For example, high cholesterol in Dominicans, almost 48%. So basically across Latinos, like half of Latinos have high cholesterol. You don't see as much of a pattern here as you'll see for the women, although you do see lower prevalences in those from South America. If you go to the next slide, amongst women, you see these same high prevalences across the different cultural heritages. So we can see there's not the greatest health profile for Latinos in the United States. What's really striking is the high prevalence, the highest is among Puerto Rican women than the other cultural heritages. I don't know exactly why this is. Many researchers don't know exactly why this is. It does point to intervention and to not say, well, all Latino women are the same. No, according to health profile, we can see clear differences. In South Americans, you saw a little bit of the pattern with men. I attribute that with kind of geographic location. So those in South America, from South America that are living in the United States, in order to make that trek, in order to be able to afford the transportation and then to live in the United States, probably a higher level of education and income. And we know that health profiles tend to go in line with education and income. Okay, so we see, I will say overall, poor health amongst Latinos within the United States. You can go to the next slide, please. The focus of my work tends to be with Latinos who are 65 and older. You have probably heard about the graying of America, the demographic shift with baby boomers now being 65 and older. So we've seen this shift in the population to many more older adults. And this is true in general for the United States. What's really interesting is that from 2000 to 2009, if you look at the data for whites, there was a 10% increase in whites 65 and older. And you think of absolute number, that's a lot of people. What a lot of people are not aware of is that when you look at the increase of older Latinos in the United States over that same time period, there was a 59% increase. So there are many more older Latinos living in the United States than in the past. What about looking forward? That's kind of the somewhat recent past. Moving forward. In 2017, Latinos were 8% of all older adults in the United States. By 2060, it's projected that Latinos will be more than 1 in 5 older adults will identify as Latino in some fashion. So I think about this in a couple ways. When I think about it in terms of research, because that's what I do for my living. And people are there, right? Too many researchers, scientists are saying like, well, Latinos, older Latinos don't want to participate in our research, so they're not included here. It is on us as the research team to create atmospheres, to create research protocols so that Latinos want to participate. Not only will, but want to participate, because the population is there. If you go to the next slide, remember that increase in number of older Latinos by 2060. This was research that showed by 2060, there will be an increase. The projected increase in the number of Latinos in the United States with Alzheimer's disease is going to increase by 832%. So if you look at that red line, that's the total cases. These break it down by youngest old, middle old, and oldest old. You see this tremendous increase in the number of Latinos with Alzheimer's disease. So outside of research, when you talk about society-wise, healthcare-wise, individual health-wise, our society is not ready for this. We really are not, because we struggle to adequately care for people and care partners of people who have Alzheimer's who are English speaking. So when you complicate that with a different language, such as Spanish, there's going to be a lot of suffering that goes on, unfortunately. Not to be a Debbie Downer there, but it's in preparation. We see these projections. This is one projection. There are many others that show this similar pattern. We need to do something about it. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about culture, and in a caveat slide here are that, I mean, admittedly, there are many factors that influence culture, right? For example, geographic location. So if we're talking about Mexico and you have somebody who was born and raised on a ranch, and you have somebody else who was born and raised in the F.A. Mexico City, there's likely going to be a difference that maybe is more attributable to rural versus urban, because they're both Mexican, right? So admittedly, there are factors that influence culture. Next slide, please. The other caveat slide that I have is that in working with Latinos or any group, especially a group that researchers are not familiar in working with us, it is helpful to have a technical knowledge and a framework of what people are like, but it is really best to understand an individual, their values, their education. When it comes to Latinos, what is their immigration experience? Maybe what is their immigration status? Because we know all of these are factors that are very important and very salient in the everyday lives of Latinos. So these are my caveat slides, because I'm going to talk about shared and common values, but I don't want people to think that me and my group believe that these values are common to each and every Latino, or to think that these are cultural values that are only present in Latinos. No, not at all. I mean, you might see these and say, hey, I think there's overlap here with Latinos, these cultural values you're presenting about for Latinos, but also I see prevalent in my cultural heritage. Absolutely. Okay, next slide, please. There are shared cultural beliefs and values, and over time, our group has seen these play out, not only in the lives of Latinos, but especially related to the physical activity and health. So one, familismo, or familism, strong identification and attachment of people with their families. I have heard people say, oh, family first, and then their actions don't really show family first. I have seen others, many Latinos, drop everything when there's a family member in need, Or when there's something positive, something to celebrate, there's reciprocity and solidarity among members of the same family. And it's not just the nuclear family that you might see in the United States. It includes the aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. Is wide. Another one, personalismo, a focus on let's know each other first. Let's trust each other first before we get into the business at hand. So this might be when trying to establish new relationships with community-based organizations, or it might be when you see somebody for the first time in a while. I was born and raised in the US. I tend to be high anxious as well. And so when I do meetings, I'm usually thinking about like, okay, how long is this meeting going to last? Well, it's probably going to last this long. So then I can get back to my office and I can work on this after that. And I have learned to be flexible to say when I have these community meetings, I just have to let it flow, let it go, and just talk. And then hopefully we get to the business that I was hoping to discuss at that meeting. Another one you've likely heard of, machismo. There's a lot of negative connotations for machismo. I mean, including the like masculine toxicity, and so that is there. But there are also elements of machismo that are meant to be more positive, like to be caring and responsible for other people, for your family, that type of thing. Okay, next slide, please. The last couple that I think are important when it comes to health, Marianismo, which is in a way like not the opposite, but of a kind of machismo. Marianismo is for women, from like Mother Mary, and the view that women should be responsible and care for other people. And is quite interesting, speaking with younger Latina women, say that are in college, that talk about their parents seeing them, they want them to act in this way. But then they say, yeah, but I want my own career. I don't want to be caring for other people. I want to, I have a lot that I want to do with my life. So there's conflict sometimes, and there's guilt sometimes as well. And the last one, fatalismo. I have no control over this. If I'm meant to get diabetes, then I'm going to get diabetes. This is in God's hands. I don't have control of this. And so this can play a role in the way people act or don't act relative to physical activity. Okay, next slide, please. So I've talked about these cultural values, kind of gave hints at how they play a role, but let's take a look at why they actually matter for older Latinos when it comes to regular exercise. So in my field for exercise, we talk about it as structured and planned physical activity. All kinds of body movement are good for you. That's physical activity. If you walk to the store and you walk back, that is excellent for your health. But you might have just been going because you would have taken a car if you had it, but you don't, so you walked. Exercise is planned, structured, repetitive over time. So why don't older Latinos exercise on a regular basis? Next slide, please. The literature and our work show several primary barriers that rise to the top. And I've put these into red, which I look at as more cultural, and then the blue, which are really prevalent, but are more circumstantial. Okay, racism, the health concerns. We looked at the health profile of Latinos, and there's a lot of chronic disease. It's not because people are Latino. It's because of the structure of the US society, the way that we structure neighborhoods and where people can live, and how do you have access to fruits and vegetables and parks and fitness facilities. Safety concerns, which are lots of times due to a fear of crime. It's not because people are Latino, it's the circumstances that Latinos find themselves in. The red ones, lack of time. If you talk to anybody, the primary reason people don't exercise is lack of time. And if you're caring for others, that familismo, the marianismo, it can become difficult to find time to exercise. And a big one that I believe is older Latinos not having experience with exercise as we think about it in the United States. And I'll get more to that point in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So what can we do about this? A couple reviews have suggested interventions that are culturally relevant, are low cost, because we know the circumstances of many Latinos in terms of not having a lot of disposable income, and consideration of the environmental factors. Somebody might say, well, walking's easy. All you do is you put on your gym shoes. That's what we call them here in Chicago. You put on your gym shoes and you go walk the neighborhood. Well, what if you don't feel comfortable walking the neighborhood? It's not that easy then, right? So there's a consideration of environmental factors, and we need more culturally appropriate interventions. Next slide, please. So here it is with dance as a form of physical activity. Next slide, please. However, it's not quite that easy. So if you're Latino or not, you might know that dancing is quite popular amongst Latinos. So you say, well, what's innovative about dancing amongst Latinos? I will tell you behaviorally, nothing. Research-wise, a lot, because there is not a whole lot of research on if people dance, what are the health benefits. The other things that I ran into, I was born and raised in the city in Chicago on the north side of the city in the Portage Park neighborhood. But then I left for most of my 20s and into my 30s. And so there's 77 designated community areas in Chicago proper. I don't know people in all of them. And then I knew them when I was younger. So I'm an outsider coming in saying, hey, I have these ideas of dance research. So why are they going to trust me? I am Mexican American, but I understand the privilege that I have as a white passing Latino. I have that privilege, but when I'm trying to create connections with Latinos in community-based organizations, that is actually a disadvantage for me, because then they say, well, who are you? Right. And what are you doing? You know, or are you just another one of these white researchers that comes in and like preys upon our community? And the irony of all of my dance work, I don't really dance. I'm not really good at dancing. I don't like to dance. It's kind of like this circle of like, which came first? I don't know. It's cognitively challenging for me. The more you think about dancing, what moves comes next, the more robotic you look, the less fluid you look, maybe the less enjoyable it is. I really like traditional exercise, but I understand not everybody does. So what about dance? Next slide. So as a way to overcome these, there are many older Latinos who don't have experience with research, really don't know what is research. Like, what does that mean? Are you going to experiment on me? Right? Like, am I going to be some sort of guinea pig in your studies? So there's that distrust. There's also, since, prior to 2016, but especially in 2016, we saw an increase in racist, hate-related crimes, and we are still feeling it. Again, I recognize the history since the US started, right, and before, but recently people don't want to provide information, whether people are documented or not. People do not want to provide personal information about themselves. So is this need to make research personal and keep it personal? Remember the personalismo value. Next slide, please. So this is the way things usually are, right? We take the academia exit on the way to our ivory tower, and everybody else takes the other exit to the real world. And we try as researchers, especially community engaged, community-based research, to overcome this, to fight this. But this is the view of many people. Why is it the view? Because it has a history of happening, right? So this is something that we need to overcome. Next slide, please. One model that I really, really subscribe to was developed by my colleagues at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, Drs. Crystal Glover and Raj Shah. It's engage, it's developing into engaged. What I really love about this, if you look at the first two parts of this model, network and give first, it has nothing to do with me as a researcher. How is this going to help me? It's about others. Network, gain that trust and respect of people and the community-based organizations and the community leaders. And partially in which the way you gain that trust and respect is you give first. What kind of information do you have that is useful to other people? For us, it's related to brain health, right? So you ask the average person, what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? How are they related? Are they the same? Are they slightly? Most people don't know. So we have information about that. What about chronic conditions like hypertension and diabetes? How will these impact if I get Alzheimer's disease? We can give information on that. Health behaviors, diet, exercise, physical activity. So we can give first. We can give information. We can be at health fairs. We can do memory screenings. We can do balance screenings. All of these things are a way to give first and really gain the trust. And then you get to the A part of advocating for research to try to get participation in research. And then you're right back to other focused. You give back. It's not trying to pull the wool over somebody's eyes to say we aren't benefiting from this at all. No, it's transparent up front. We need participants in order to do research. We need participants who are historically underrepresented in research so that we can know how these results apply to different types of people. And without that participation, we don't have those findings. So a model, we're working on a paper so that we can have this more widespread. Next slide, please. So we had the idea of Latin dance. I had the idea for a long time, which again is not that, it's really not innovative in society wise, but it is research wise. And so when I started at University of Illinois, Chicago, then I started in this work. We did interviews with Latin dance instructors. We did some focus groups with older Latinos. I had a colleague in public health who said, how do you know older Latinos are going to want to dance? And I said, well, I just know this from life. And then he said, okay, so NIH reviewers aren't going to care what you think you know. You probably want to collect some data. So I did. Focus group data, phenomenal, fascinating types of feedback that we got, reminiscing about the past, and lack of access and resources programming now. So we did the Bailamos pilot study. Next slide, please. I co-created the program with Miguel Mendez. You can see him there leading our pilot, like 13 years ago. He's a professional dance instructor. He comes with the dance, I come with the science. We created the program together. If you read the literature, there are many forms of exercise that are not considered by some to be appropriate for older Latinos. Why are you doing that? Why are you trying to be young? Why are you lifting weights? Like, you're not young, just accept it. And so walking and dancing are ones that tend to be more accepted. And the idea, those who exercise probably like it to some degree. Those who dance really like it. So it's not like an activity that's thought of as boring and tedious and oh my God, that's so hard. There are lab-based studies, not from myself, but from others, of dance when they're wearing heart rate monitors and you ask people, how hard do you feel you're working? There's an RPE scale and you ask them that. People don't realize how hard they're actually working when they're dancing. Their heart rate tends to be elevated, but they give a score that's usually correlated with a lower heart rate. So if we can get dance benefits and not even realize we're working hard, why wouldn't we want to promote this? Next slide, please. So this Bailamos dance program, it's being revised. So right now it's a 4-month, 2 times a week program. You can see the different styles of dance. They're more Caribbean based. That's because Miguel is Puerto Rican. and those are the styles that he knows best. A colleague of mine, you'll see her photo in a few minutes, Dr. Suzy Aguinaga, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, is expanding it to 6 months and adding in cumbia and samba. And so we'll have a 6-month program with other types of styles that Mexicans are going to be more interested in. So we have the dance, they learn individually, then they partner up. They don't join with a partner, they can, but then we rotate partners. Okay, so nobody gets too used to interacting with one person themselves. And we added in sessions of open dancing, feedback we got from the pilot. You're moving too fast. By the time I really learn how to do this one step, you're moving on to the next and I don't have a chance to practice it. So we added fiestas once a month. Open dancing is every other week. Fiestas are like the potlucks. Bring food, bring drink. And then after we dance, then we will socialize and share food and drink with each other to add in that cultural component as well. And health education was our control group. All of these programs are in Spanish. Next slide, please. So in order to get participants, you need to recruit. Since my time, since 2007 in Chicago, I spent a lot of time with that networking, really trying to network and give first. And then we got to the recruitment stage. So I highlight the red because these tend to be our most efficient forms of recruitment, and they're in red because if you remember, I had like the red ones were like where cultural values come into play. So we'll have an agreement with, say, a senior center that we're going to offer the dance program there. The dance program is never offered at the university. It's within somebody's neighborhood. So there are usually Latinos, older Latinos, who go to that senior center, community center, et cetera. So we will recruit there. One, for example, has a Latino club, Herencia Latina, which is in Spanish, and it was twice a month, and people would gather there for different activities. So Latinos tend to be social, and this gives a chance to interact with people who are like you. Spanish masses, we have found, where do you have a large number of older Spanish-speaking Latinos at one time? In Chicago, I don't know about other places, it is Roman Catholic Spanish masses. Chicago is a very Catholic city overall, and there are churches that have 8 masses in Spanish every Sunday. Okay, 8 masses. So it's like every hour and a half or something like that, there's another mass. So what we have done is we've partnered with churches where we get permission to a couple things. One is that they will make an announcement at the end of their mass. At the end of every Catholic mass, there's announcements. Sometimes we would make the announcement, sometimes the priest would do it, or sometimes one of their staff members would do it. There's a weekly bulletin. We offered to stuff flyers into each and every bulletin. Sometimes they would actually print it straight into their bulletin. And then we would stand at the exits with the flyers and a sign-up sheet. Not signing up for the study, signing a form so that we could call them and give them more information. Next slide, please. All right, now I realize I'm 40 minutes in just now getting to the data. I do have some data to share, but so much of this to me, even as we have more and more data, is about the story leading up to the data. Because without all of those things that I've talked about, I don't think that our group, our research team, would have any of the data. All right. So one type of testing that we do are cognitive tests or neuropsychological tests. So one type is where you read a story to a participant and you ask them to repeat back verbatim, word for word, what they heard, right? And then you do some other, so that's immediate recall, and then you give them some other tests, and then you go back and do a delayed recall, ask them to repeat it verbatim and see how many they can remember. Next slide, please. So this is what we found. Dr. Balbin there was a PhD student with me who did this work. So quickly to orient you to the graph, you see the logical memory scores. It's the number that they were able to recall. On the left, immediate recall. On the right, that delayed recall. The red are those people who were randomized to the dance group, and in blue, those people who were randomized to the health education group. On the left-hand side, immediate memory, you see an interaction there. This interaction was not quite statistically significant. There's a P of 0.09, I believe, but you can see the trend there. There were 57 people in this study in particular here. But what was really fascinating to me is on the right side, a significant interaction such that from before those randomized to the dance program, they could remember a little over 7 items. They could recall 7 items in delayed recall. After the 4-month dance intervention, they were able to remember almost 10 items. The health education group basically stayed the same, which we didn't have any cognitive training, physical activity training, so that is not too surprising. But that change in the dance group, what they were able to remember, was pretty definitely of interest to us to explore in larger trials, because when you think about walking can increase aspects of cognition. Wonderful. If you think about dancing, so now you have these different components. You have the elevated heart rate. You have to remember your dance steps, what comes next. You have to be able to react to a dance partner. You have the touch involved. You have music involved. So all of these things that independently can be related to mood and cognition, you now have in one package. So scientifically, some have said to me, yeah, but you can't break down how much of the improvement is because of the music, say. And I say, okay, statistically, we could try to do this, but overall, for public health, I'm fine with it. That's okay. Right? If we know that it works as a package, let's deliver the package to people. Next slide, please. We then took this work and said, what about a dance program for older Latinos who already have mild cognitive impairment? So not dementia at that end, and not those without any type of impairment, which was the last study and the majority of the studies that we do. So this is Dr. Aguinaga who conducted this study. Next slide, please. We collaborated with an adult wellness center in the Humboldt Park neighborhood in Chicago. People can get bused there. They don't have to find their own transportation. Everybody there speaks Spanish. There's about 70 to 75 older adults who are there on a daily basis, and they have different rooms with different activities that the older adults can participate in. Next slide, please. Because they were older adults who had mild cognitive impairment, we found that there were some modifications we had to make to the dance program. For example, we needed a research staff person there to remind people, oh, it's Tuesday, 1 o'clock. So to go kind of gather up the people. They wouldn't necessarily remember. They didn't set a reminder for themselves. So we would have to do that. We found that the speed of the music was too fast. The ones that we had played in the community before, for those without cognitive impairment, was fine. Now it was too fast. What was helpful? Technology. Miguel has an app on his phone so that he can slow down the beats per minute. Same song, just not quite as fast, so that they could do that and feel like they were in tune with the music. We had to remove some of the dance turns. We had one person who fell. Thankfully, they were okay. IRB cleared the incident, but that said, okay, maybe we need to change things a little bit. So we simplified things. Next slide, please. We ended up with people average age of 75. This is, I don't know how it is like in Kansas, in the Kansas City area. All of these people spoke Spanish. 2/3 of them speak only Spanish, but they've been in the United States for 30 years. right? So it's not like these were new in general. This is not that they were new immigrants to the US and so they spoke Spanish. No, most had been here. And they tend to be low income with an average years of education at 6. When we do our community studies, it tends to be about 8 to 10 years on average of education. So these are things that we have to remember. We can't just deliver any type of information, any type of program. There's literacy concerns and there are health literacy concerns. Next slide, please. So this is with the delayed recall. You can see with these participants, you can see that in general, they have MCI. They were able to remember fewer items than the people in the other study that did not have any type of cognitive impairment. And here with this group, you see those that were in the dance group improved the number of items they were able to recall by a couple, whereas the control group, it was a waitlist control group in this study, they actually decreased a bit in the number of items they were able to remember. So a little more evidence from for the impact of the dancing on cognition. Next slide, please. So there we see a moderate effect size. Then this led into an R01 that we did. So this was funded by NIA, the National Institute of Nursing Research. They were interested in funding this. So it was actually not through NIA. You can see the collaborators there. And this was the BILA trial. Next slide, please. I'll just show you what happened. The CHAMPS is a regular physical activity self-report measure of physical activity. And the difference in the R01 from the earlier studies too, we added a maintenance program. That initial 4-month, the blue line are people that were in the 4-month Bailamos dance program, and those in the red or the orange were in the health education group. And you can see that those in the dance group reported doing more physical activity at the end of the 4 months than those in health education. The 4-month maintenance program was meant to be a train the trainer model. So we ended up with 12 sites in the Chicago area. We trained a few people from the initial group on how to lead the dance program, and we added dance moves onto where they had left off for each of the styles. And those participants were invited, bring along a friend or two if you would like, bring a guest to these dance programs. So we're trying to find ways to like make it fresh and make it new. So over that maintenance period, they maintained their physical activity level. They didn't increase further, but they also didn't decrease to baseline levels. And those in the control group, they didn't get anything over that 4-month period. They ended up going down a little bit in their physical activity. So some people have said to me, rightfully, truthfully, well, you gave them a dance program twice a week. So yeah, of course they increased their physical activity. And I say, exactly. So if they didn't have the dance program, they would not have increased their physical activity or barely increased their physical activity. We wouldn't really know why they increased their physical activity, but this shows the impact that incorporating a dance program into their lives had on their physical activity. Next slide, please. So I just have a few more slides that I think are important to talk about, and then we'll open it up. We struggled with attendance. I had a group of Latinos on my team, everybody on my team, Latino, Spanish speaking, who were trying to think, what kind of barriers are we going to run into? What are we going to have to overcome? So we were ready in that case. I built my team I was an assistant professor at the time, and I had all full professors, 3 of whom had been doing physical activity randomized controlled trials for at least 30 years each, because I wanted that expertise. And in spite of all that, we ran into issues. I talked to some of them, my colleagues / mentors, and said, I don't understand how you end up with these adherence rates that you do. What's going on? What do you do? He said, well, they're so like, well, try this. I'll be like, yeah, we tried that. Well, try this. Yeah, that's not going to work with this group of older urban Spanish speaking Latinos who tend to be low income with lower levels of education, and kept getting these ideas. And then and finally my advisor, Eddie McCauley, said, he calls me Dave. He said, Dave, I don't know what to tell you. Write a paper about it. So we did. And if you go to the next slide, the next couple slides are going to be from this paper that we wrote. Probably the paper I am most proud of, or one of the most proud papers I have, because I think it's practically useful, right? This slide, if you hit next, I think it'll bring on a red box. Yeah, so a recruitment challenge. We talked about the importance of trust. So potential, not definite, potential solutions or strategies. Promotoras or community health workers, that bilingual, bicultural staff. If you hit next, which I can't remember where. Yes, working late into life. Many older Latinos are not like retiring, working hourly jobs, so needing to work late in life. Why does that matter? People dropped out of the study. They didn't have a job when the trial started, and then they're like, hey, I got to stop coming because I got a new job, or my shift was changed on me. Now, they don't have control over this kind of thing. So this matters. Next. Low literacy. So we do all of our assessments interview style. We never say, okay, here's this packet of surveys, please complete it and return it to us. Or we never say, we're going to mail you questionnaires, mail it back to us. We can't do that. So this has implications. It takes longer, it's more expensive, it's more personnel, but it's what needs to be done. Next slide, please. We then go into recruitment challenges. If you can hit the next couple red. Yeah, so we had people go back home to Mexico to care for others, right? Familismo, you drop what you're doing and you tend to people in your family who need assistance. All right, so my advisor that I mentioned, who does work in central Illinois with middle to upper class, majority middle upper class white adults, he didn't have that. He never experienced this. And this was relatively common for us. So, you know, I recommend if you do work with older Latinos, this is physical activity intervention, but I think it could be broader to physical activity research or health promotion interventions in general. Next slide, please. Yes. So in summary, we know that Latinos are a large proportion of the older adult population, and this proportion continues to grow. Many Latinos do have poor health profiles, so we need programs, we need resources that are accessible and understandable, and that people want to go and get and go and use. And so the bottom line to me, the cultural values is just a part of everyday life. And these must be considered when we work with people in research, as I've highlighted, or in practice as well. Next slide, please. So I'd like to acknowledge my PhD students, Michelle and Miguel, and Juan, who is an undergraduate student who's doing research with us. Next slide, please. And the different sources of funding that we've had to help us do this work over the years. Next slide. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I've seen a bunch of things go into the chat. I haven't been able to read them.
Yeah, we'll start if it's okay. First of all, I think you're an amazing presenter. You
Thank you.
wove everything together, you know, connected everything you started with, you know, it just flowed throughout your presentation. It was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I would like to start with Dr. Camargo because she was the first to put a question in the chat. Dr. Camargo, would you like to ask your question, please?
So first, thank you so much for presenting about your study and your findings. Everything was very interesting, very enlightening, and some of the things you presented doing research in Kansas City are very similar to what we see in the Latino population here.
Okay.
I didn't work with older population. I worked with pregnant population in the past, but some of the things overlap. especially for recruitment and retention in clinical trials.
Yeah.
Well, I had a couple of questions, but the first one I would ask, and I know it's more related to the SOLVE study, and I have particular interest, especially because I'm South American.
Okay.
So what is the distribution of nativity on the SOLVE study? Do you know? Because, and I wrote that in the chat, because I find hard to draw conclusions about South
Yeah.
Americans
Yeah.
because they're so large.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm right. It's the same criticism can be applied there that the authors and investigators apply to previous research, right? Like, oh, we can't group people together because there's important differences, yet, you know, that's done. So it's better, but it's not quite there. Yes, I mean, it's in the hundreds, right? The hundreds of people, because part of this is that the way the Soul would recruit, it was actually door to door. Okay, so when they initially recruited, people couldn't just say, oh, I want to be in this study, I'm Latino, I want to be in this study. It was by census tracts where there were predominantly Latino neighborhoods. And so they would go door to door to try to get people to participate in the research. Okay, so I mean, in Chicago, there's, you know, it's primarily Mexican and Puerto Rican. In just with those two cultural heritages, that's like 85% of the Latinos in the Chicago area. Okay, so you're already not able to get large numbers. So that's a great question. There might be more soul studies. If you do a search for soul studies now, there's hundreds of them. So that might be addressed in one or some or many of them.
Okay. So it's a gap that would be interesting to check
Yes.
for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
And then other question that I had that I posted was related for retention in your trials. Like, did you do any analysis to see if the previous occupation from people joining the study, and then I had in mind, for example, people who work on cleaning services or construction in the past, if that impact on their interest to join the trial or participate in a physical activity trial or not? I was curious about that.
That's a great question that we didn't ask anything about. We didn't collect that data. You know, I've seen a lot with like older African Americans about like a rest ethic, right? Like, I worked my butt off throughout my life, working hard work. Like, now that I'm retired or I don't work, I'm just going to rest, right? So there's also the thought of like, if you did more manual labor, so related to that, like, what does your body feel like? And, you know, do you feel like dancing? So I don't know. Those are great points that maybe for my next trial. Next is a virtual. I don't know how this is going to work, but we have funding from the CDC to do a virtual to try to overcome some of these barriers that I had mentioned. And just, you know, like, I know we're at the end of time. I apologize. I tend to talk, but I'm free to stick around if other people have questions.
Thank you. We will stay on. Whoever can stay on can stay, and whoever needs to leave. I know Jaime had a question or two as well.
Okay.
If he's
Hi,
still
David.
on.
Yes, I'm right here. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's amazing as always. So my questions were, one, and it's probably related to the answer that you just gave about the new grant that you just got from the CDC. Like, what do we do with people who live in rural areas?
Yeah.
In Kansas, there's a huge Latino population in the Southwest, and it's mostly rural, very scattered. So what do we do with that population? And another one is, in your trials, have you found any differences by nativity with regards to the, well, I was thinking of efficacy, but I'm also thinking of actually, now that Juliana mentioned it, also retention as well. Obviously, I'm referring to, I am assuming that those who are not born in the United States might have more barriers, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, we've talked about analyzing some of the data like that from the R01. So that had 333. Can you hear me? I think I might have hit my, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. We randomized 333 people in the RO1, so there were a lot of people. So, but we haven't been able to get into yeah, like nativity, like where people were born. Another thing too, I wonder if more people of Mexican descent dropped out versus say Puerto Rican, because it was more Caribbean styles. The one thing I passed over that I didn't talk about was like, I think it's cultural as well. Like not a single person told us, you know, I dropped out because I got bored of your program, or I dropped out because I just didn't like it. You know, they would just avoid our calls or tell us something else, right? So I think that's cultural. So but I feel like this like kind of sub analyses are so important to really be able to move forward. Haven't done that yet. And then what was the other question? Maybe the first one, I think.
The rural, what
Oh
do we do
yeah,
with
like
people
I
living
think
in
that'd be
rural?
great, right? So depending on people's, you know, Wi-Fi strength or access, but if that can be provided, especially for a study. Yeah, I don't know. So Susie Aguinaga is she's in week 8 right now of a remote program, and then I'm going to use what she's doing to, with her permission, I won't just take it. We're colleagues. So you know, I saw a picture last week about how it's set up. So Miguel is in his studio and he has this really nice background in the way it's set up. So you can see, you know, him doing the dance moves, full body, that kind of thing. So now you're missing the touch part,
Yeah.
right? It's the one part is actual touch. The other is like, it's probably more enjoyable dancing with somebody than always doing steps by yourself.
Or the social component too.
Yeah, so I talk about, I think we need to create some group cohesion
Yeah.
first, right? So that at least people know each other, and then, but you do lose out on that. But when you're talking about settings like rural, there's no other option, right? So maybe something like this would work. Hopefully we'll know, I mean, I guess it'll be a little bit, but you know, from Susie's trial, which will end in a couple months, and then ours probably won't, the grant won't start until October. So anyway, there are these ideas that I think can work potentially, hopefully work for like rural populations.
That's
Right.
very exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's really interesting. And I'm wondering too, like even like kind of like hybrid, so that like you have 4 that are virtual, and then once
Yeah,
a month you have a community event that people can attend if they can, something like that, so that they get both the community, but they are maybe able to attend more regularly virtually.
right. And somebody, when I was talking about the grant, you know, with like a collab potential not organizations, like we have like providers councils in the Chicago area and stuff.
Mhm.
And so somebody said, well, what if I were to get together 10
Mhm.
people in my community room at our community center?
Yeah.
Then we could have, like, I don't know if they have a projector or what, but we wouldn't need the instructor physically. We could be remote,
Yeah.
but it's not like everybody in their home one by
Yeah.
one by one remote. You would have 10 of us. And I thought, well, I didn't think about, like, I never thought about that. I was just thinking more about people individually in their
Yeah.
home, but I thought, wow, that would have really good reach. Although there
Mhm.
might be that social, they would be able to dance with a partner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Others would not. Maybe that's another study design, right?
Well,
To explore.
and then you wonder, okay, is it so much about community that people like, could you offer it both asynchronous and synchronous, so that like if my schedule
Yes.
didn't allow me, could I do it later? Would I do it? I think that'd be
Right.
interesting
Right.
to see. What could, or is the community the driving factor?
Right, because we're gonna have that available. I mean, we're gonna record sessions
Yeah.
in
Oh,
case
perfect.
people want to do it on their own, maybe even want to practice. Maybe they were at class and then they're like, "Oh, I
Yes,
just couldn't get that one move.
that would
Let,
be
let me
me.
let me play this to see if I can get it." Which was not available with any of our prior trials. If you
Yeah,
missed the in-person, you missed it.
missed it.
Mhm,
Interesting. This is great.
mhm.
I think there were several comments about it just being about dance resonated with some
Oh,
individuals.
cool. Yeah.
So,
I
mhm.
love that. Right. So at my core, I'm about physical activity and movement.
Yeah.
And so it's whatever you like to do it, you know. And now compared to, I don't know, like I always hear back about like the 70s were about like, if you, that was, you know, if you're not running, that's it. If you're not running, don't bother being active, or, you know, no pain, no gain kind of stuff. And so now it's, man, there's so many different types of activities people can do. And yeah, if you like to, but part of our thing is like, if people like to go dancing, what are the benefits from it? For a
Mhm.
large part, we still don't know, but we know more than we did, say, 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's fabulous. It's just wonderful. I did have one final question, and I may not even be able to articulate this because I'm not in healthcare and I'm not a researcher, but
Mhm, mhm.
I was curious, just like how comorbidities, like if I had rheumatoid arthritis or,
Mhm.
diabetes, like how did that impact maybe participation or how people felt, about dancing? Did it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we collect data on chronic conditions. We have tended to only have that as a descriptive variable, like,
Mhm.
you know, on average, how many chronic conditions do people have in a sample,
Mhm.
which tends to be like a couple. Um, but I don't know how that plays a role
Mhm.
in participation in outcomes. I mean, that would also be something we could look at. Maybe some in particular are most like debilitating or stopping people from, especially like an arthritis one.
Right. Bad knees. That's what I was
Bad
thinking.
knees,
Knee
yes,
hurt.
yes.
Yeah.
In
Mhm.
this grant from the CDC, we're actually comparing the Bailamos at home with Fit and Strong, which is an evidence-based, more traditional program that's actually meant for people with osteoarthritis. And
Oh,
so we'll be able to see a little bit in comparison that way. Now that won't be direct, and that won't be those with osteoarthritis who dance, like, but anyway, that's when you said osteoarthritis, it made me think of that, where
yeah.
there are programs specifically designed for people with osteoarthritis.
Great. Any last comments, questions from anybody? You can unmute yourselves.
I'm taking a quick look at the uh, comments.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you. And you can feel free to share my email address if people have questions that they weren't able to, or want to discuss research ideas, whatever it might be. I'm very happy to follow up with anybody who's interested.
Well, we are so just grateful that you were able to join us today, your willingness, great presentation. When someone like myself can follow it, you've done a great job.
Okay, good. I
So
appreciate
thank
that. I really
you.
appreciate the invitation, especially Jaime. Thanks again too.
Yeah, thank you, Jaime, for sure. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Okay.